Welcome, folk. Today we're looking at Life Sciences Paper 2, and we're going to look at the topics community structure and change. So what is community structure and change? It deals with looking at interactions in communities and looking at how organisms have arranged themselves in a society so that they survive efficiently. We would also look at some questions in population ecology which actually tie in. And you've got to remember that the examiner will not exclusively set a question on population ecology or community structure, but they will look at opportunities where they integrate the two topics together. So a hint would be not to look at the questions exclusively based on topic, but to look at a question based on the overall preparation for the paper. So let's look at the first question that we have today. So this question has been adapted from the Feb 2012 examination, and it's a question 1 in that section. Let's look at the first question. This is a multiple choice question. Here various options are provided as possible answers to the following questions. We've got to choose the correct answer. 1.1. All organisms in a given area, as well as the abiotic factors with which they interact, are best described as or and. Let's look at that. So when we look at the interaction of organisms with a community and themselves or their habitat, we refer to that as an ecosystem. So the definition for ecosystem would be the interaction of organisms with both themselves and the abiotic factors or the environment. So the answer for this would be ecosystems. When we look at the options that were given to us, community is wrong, habitat would refer to the area in which the organisms survive, and population would refer to the number of organisms belonging to that species in that given area. So the obvious answer for that would be ecosystem. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following is an example of predation? Guys, if we look at predation, predation refers to the relationship between a larger predator and a smaller prey. So we've got to look for, in this question, we've got to look for the answer that is most closest, that displays the relationship between a larger predator and a smaller prey. Let's look at the options that are given to us. A is a bees visiting a flower, and that would not be correct. Ticks on a dog, that would not be correct, as that is a parasitic relationship. A lion catching a zebra, which would be a large predator catching a prey, and a bird's nest on a tree would be a social organization interaction. The answer for this would be C, as it shows us the interaction between a larger predator and a smaller prey. Let's move on to the next question, guys. 1.3. Which one of the following increases the chances of survival of a species? Okay, we've got to look, when we look at this, we've got to think about interactions where organisms have adapted several interactions or societies within their populations so that they can increase their chances of survival. So we've got to look at, in these options, look at what adaptation allows them a greater chance of survival of that specific species. So let's look at A, living individually. Guys, if you know, being by yourself in the wild is not being very brave. So I'm sure living individually will not enhance your chances of survival. Okay, living in a colony where there's division of labor. Okay, and let me explain, and that seems to be the most obvious answer at this moment in time. When we live in a colony and there's division of labor, it simply means that the workload between the organisms in that population, between the individuals in that population, has been decreased, which allows them a greater chance of survival. So there are fewer organisms that hunt. There will be specific breeding pairs or partners that carry out specific functions. So all this means is that when we divide labor, when we divide the work, there's a greater chance that organisms can specialize and ensure that that population survives. So the answer for this would be B. Having random breeding pairs. Why that is not correct is that when we look at the wild, when we have breeding hierarchies in certain societies or certain organizations, the organisms that breed successfully are the dominant pair. And the reason why they do that is to ensure that the organisms that the stronger individuals give off their stronger characteristics or their favorable characteristics to the offspring. And that is essentially why breeding randomly will not be a favorable characteristic for the survival of a species. Hunting for prey with different species, and that's often an intra-specific competition. You want to be hunting as a pack with members of belonging to the same species, as that resource will be shared amongst that population. When hunting is with different species, which often does not happen, the resource when acquired there would be further competition between the different species for their survival. So that will not ensure a population or species surviving. So the correct answer for this would be B. Let's move on to the next question. This is a graph, so let's look at the graph below. It shows the relationship between two species of mammals. So we see two species of mammals in this graph. Here we see species X and species Y. The graph shows us the number of species X on this axis and the number of species on the y-axis using this. So here I'm going to try and represent the different graphs using different colors. So here we're going to use that to represent species X, and that would be this graph here. And to represent species Y, let's change that to this. So we're going to use species Y, we're going to use that. Now guys, before we attempt to answer the questions, if we look at this very quickly, here we see, in terms of numbers, if we look at species Y, which is this here, we've got to look at this axis here. Okay, so that's the number of species Y is 25, the maximum number, and of species X would be, okay, so we go back to our graph, species X, which is these individuals here, and that's probably about 160. Now if we compare the numbers between species X and Y, we would see that species Y is smaller in numbers and species X are larger in numbers. Now in any relationship between two species, when we find the number of organisms being larger, it would indicate that they are smaller, and when we see that the species are smaller in number, it would indicate that these organisms are larger. So if this was a prey-predator relationship, we would expect that the organisms that are fewer in number would be the predators, and the organisms larger in number would be the smaller prey. So let's look at the questions based on this. Which deduction made from the information provided in the graph is correct? And as I deduced, I said that organisms that are larger in number would be the prey. So in this case, X would be the prey, and organisms which are fewer in number would be the larger predators, and in this case Y would be the predator. Okay, so that's the conclusion that I can draw from the graph. Let's look at the options that are presented to us. Species X is the predator and Y is the prey, which is not correct from our deduction. Species X and species Y are competing for the same resource. That's not true. They compete. Species Y, which is the predator, will prey on X. Species Y is the predator and species X is the prey, and that is clearly, we can see that clearly from the graph. So the most correct answer for this, or the correct answer for this, would be C. Okay, D, we can still look at D. An increase in species X causes a decrease in species Y, and when we look at the graph, we see that an increase in species Y actually causes a decrease in species X. So that answer would be incorrect. We're still moving on to the next question, also related to community structure and competition within species. If two species in a community occupy the same niche and resources are scarce, one will be lost due to, and this is when we find that organisms occupy a habitat or a niche that is a smaller area within a population, within an environment, and they compete for a resource. If that resource is a common resource where one species outcompetes the other, or competes and excludes the other, we refer to that as competitive exclusion. Why? Because the one dominant species has eliminated or excluded the other species from the competition. So that would be a type of competitive exclusion. So the answer for this would be resource partitioning would be wrong, as this refers to the resources being shared, and this is not an example of sharing of resources. This is an example of competition, and where one species is excluded from sharing that resource. It's not predation or succession. So the answer for this would be competitive exclusion. we're going to go on to the next set of questions, and these deal with terminology. So it's important. You got to know your terminology well, because we often see questions in this topic coming up in your terminology, your multiple choice, you're matching your columns. So you've got to know your terminology very well for this section. Let's go through the next set of questions. This question has been adapted from the March exams 2012 and some from the exemplars from 2011 paper 2. Let's go. Give the correct biological term, guys, for each of the following descriptions. 2.1. The relationship between two species in which both benefit from their association. And we often refer to this where both the organisms benefit from each other as a mutualistic relationship, or we call that mutualism. And the fundamental concept behind mutualism is that both the organisms benefit from existing with each other. And we often see this in nature. In order for organisms to survive together harmoniously, they need to benefit from each other. And we refer to that as a mutualistic relationship. So let's go on to, so that will be mutualism. Okay, let's move on to the next question and see what that is. The use of resources. Okay, so we're looking at the use of resources in a slightly different way, in slightly different ways by different species in the same habitat, allowing them to coexist. And this is what we refer to as resource partitioning, where a resource is shared between two different species of organisms living in the same area. And this is essential for ensuring their survival. So you often see this where organisms eat off different heights of a tree. So you find giraffes eating off the tender tips of the tree branches that are further on top, and we find the gemsbok or even the duikers living off the leaves at the bottom, or the barks or the vegetation towards the bottom of the forest. This is an example of resource partitioning, where the resource is shared between the species or the different species that live in that community. So the answer for this would be resource partitioning. Partitioning. And the word partitioning simply means sharing or creating division of a resource. Let's look at the next question. The variety of species living organisms that exist on Earth. And the variety of species would refer to biodiversity. So we live in a country that is rich in biodiversity. The reason why we say it's rich in biodiversity because we've got a variety of species that live. And hence, on Earth, the biodiversity would refer to the variety of species that coexist. So the answer for this would be biodiversity. Okay, biodiversity. Bio meaning living, and diversity referring to the variety of species living. Let's move on to the next question. The elimination of one species by another in a habitat as a result of dependence on a common resource. This would be competition, guys. So we clearly know that there's competition, but where one species is eliminated, and we call that competitive exclusion, where species are eliminated because they compete with each other for a common resource. So we refer to this as competitive exclusion. So it's competitive exclusion. Okay, let's look at question 5, 2.5. The killing of surplus animals by humans to avoid the destruction of the natural environment. Guys, we find this often happens in nature reserves, in conservation parks, where there's a confined environment and the area cannot sustain any more animals in that confined area. And then the rangers, the park management will often then decide to kill them. And we refer to that controlled killing as culling. So you'll find that that's important to do in order to sustain the environment, because the environment cannot sustain any more of those animals, and hence they would need to be removed, translocated, and put into a new area, or they need to be culled. And often translocation is very expensive. You find that conservation parks use culling, which is termed hunting, and where tourists would come into the country and they'll pay large sums of money to hunt to hunt an animal, and that revenue will then be used by the national park, by that conservation park, to further its conservation program. So this would be culling, and culling is actually controlled hunting. Culling. Okay. Guys, we've got to go on to the next question. Also, a list of terminology. Give the correct biological terms for the following. The periodic movement out of and the return to a habitat by living organisms. And when we looked at the factors that affect population, it would be migration or emigration and immigration. So that would be organisms moving into a population or out of a population based on changes in the environment. And we refer to this term as migration. And we see birds, we see animals doing their annual migration. And this is basically moving out of an area because of a lack of resources, or moving into area where there's more favorable resources. 2.7. A group of organisms sharing similar characteristics, which are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And guys, this is the definition for the term species. The definition for the term species refers to a group of organisms having similar characteristics that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So this would be a term that describes species. So we refer to this as species. Okay, let's look at 2.8. A gradual change in the numbers and variety of organisms living in a habitat, beginning with pioneer plants and ending with a climax community. And this refers to a process of change over a period of time. And when we see pioneer species occupying a habitat and being replaced over a period of time by a complex climax species, we refer to that as succession. And often when it starts with pioneers, we refer to that as primary succession. So the answer for this would be primary succession. And here we see organisms being replaced and becoming complex over a period of time. Let's look at question 2.9. The development of community over time where species in one stage are replaced by another species. This is an example of succession as well, but this would be an example of secondary succession where one community is replaced by another. So we refer to this as an example of secondary succession. Guys, we've gone through a whole lot of terminology. Let's go for a break and I'll see you after the break. Welcome guys, hope you guys are relaxed. Let's look at the next question. It's a data response question. It's based on the culling of elephants in the Kruger National Park. I'm not going to read through this, guys. You have this, you can read through this. Let's go through the questions, let's engage with the questions, and then I'll refer to the resources. 3.1. Give the main reason mentioned above in support of culling of elephants. When we go to the context, when we go to the passage, it talks about the main reason being the destruction or the habitat re-engineering. Guys, what elephants normally do is that when they're in a confined environment and the resources are not enough for them to sustain themselves, they tend to destroy what is available to them because of their voracious, their large appetite. And hence what happens in a confined environment where they're not allowed to freely move is that they tend to start destroying the habitat. And that becomes unsustainable, not necessarily for the elephants, but also for the other animals that coexist in this case, the Kruger National Park. So the main reason for culling them, which is controlled hunting or killing them, would be to avoid any further destruction to the environment, so that the sustainability of the Kruger National Park is ensured, so that the other animals living, co-inhabiting with them, do also survive. So if we go into the next question, guys, name two alternatives to culling proposed above. So what happens normally is that culling is an alternative where the cost of translocation or removing these animals are considered. Alternatives to culling would be removing them, putting them to a national park or conservation area. But often this is expensive and it involves not necessarily moving just one, but the entire family of elephants, and that could be quite traumatizing to them. The process may take time and often it puts the animals into stress, and that is not feasible. You find that when they go into a new area, they have problems adjusting to the environment. So an alternative would be translocation. Another alternative would would be to use contraceptives, and that would be to prevent them from reproducing and their numbers increasing. And that would obviously mean that the reproduction rate slows down, and hence their numbers can be sustained within the carrying capacity of that area. A third alternative could be possibly is to increase the area, and in this case, because Kruger National Park has has a fence that borders it from Mozambique, there is a possibility that those fences were brought down, that the elephants would have a larger range to move into, which would cause less destruction to the environment in the Kruger National Park. So we've looked at alternatives for this. Let's go on to the next question, also relating to this. Draw a bar graph to show the change in the elephant population from 1998 to the year 2020. Guys, we've got to draw a bar graph. Before we draw a bar graph, guys, it's very important for us to be able to differentiate between what a bar graph is and a histogram. And remember, I spoke about a bar graph. A bar graph would have bars between them. A histogram, guys, would be a graph that has the bars connected. So here we see spaces between the bars, and here the bars are connected to each other, and hence this would be a histogram. So the question clearly states that we should draw a bar graph. So we're not expected to draw a bar graph, and if you do, you would get that wrong. And we've got to show the bar graph. So the key points, guys, to drawing a bar graph would be, or any graph would be, firstly to draw the X and Y axis, to label those axes correctly, to put in a heading, and to plot the points correctly. What I've done is I've pasted in the memorandum or the marking graph that we would use in assessing you. Let's look at how the mark allocation for this graph would be. So the examiner will be looking for the following. He'll be looking for a title, a heading for the graph. So in this case, you've got to clearly define what is on the X and Y axis, and we said here we're talking about the elephant population, and that's from the period the year 2000 to the year 2020. We also need to label the X-axis, and in this case it is time on the X-axis and the unit is years. And on the Y-axis we have the population, which is given in the number of elephants. So that will be ticked out correctly. You would then need to choose a correct scale and plot out these points correctly. So you get one for each for the labeling of the axes, one for the heading, and at least two ticks for all the bars correctly plotted. And if you've plotted a bar graph where there are spaces that are equal between them, you would get the other mark. It's often when mistakes happen and you're penalized because you've drawn a histogram, you will probably lose a mark for having drawn a histogram. So it's very important, guys, to ensure that you read the question well and you know clearly that you're drawing a bar graph when it states draw a bar graph. Let's move on to the next question. The diagram below shows some plant communities present at various time intervals on a farmland cleared of vegetation by a fire. Here we see over a period of time we had initially grass, and that was replaced in 15 years by shrubs, and after about 25 to 100 years we had pine wood growing, which are taller trees, and then 150 years later these were replaced or were succeeded by oak forests, which are large, more developed trees. When we look at this, we see a series of diagrams showing you how plants have become complexed, and that complexity increases with the period of time, and they have adapted to the environment. So we see a series of diagrams showing you grass, which obviously the pioneers in this case establishing to the environment. We see shrubs, which are now have become more evolved to the environment, and the grass has engineered and made it conducive for larger plants to be able to survive. And then we see the more complex plants, as such the pine, and then we see the climax species, in this case the oak forest, and hence that would be the most complex in terms of the succession of the plant species or the plants that we're looking at this community. Let's look at the first question. State the term used to describe the sequence of plant communities. The term that we use to describe this would be succession, where we see the pioneers being replaced by the climax communities, replacing the pioneers. Say that again for you. The pioneers over a period of time are being replaced by the climax community. Let's move on to the next question. Give a reason to explain why the shrub community is able to replace the grass community after 15 years. If we go back to the diagram, guys, here we see shrubs, and if we compare them to grasses, grasses are relatively less evolved as compared to the shrubs. What happens during the pioneer stages is that the grass will establish the environment. Lots of the grass would decompose over a period of time, and that would contribute to the fertility of the soil. The humus content of the soil would increase, and that would essentially mean that that environment will now be able to sustain shrubs, which would need a more fertile soil. It would need more nutrition, it would need more moisture content, and that has been provided by the grass establishing in that area and then eventually decomposing and contributing to the fertility of that soil, and thus able to support more complex plants. Let's move on to the next question. Oak forest in the climax community in this sequence, oak forest is the climax community in this sequence. Describe a feature of the climax community. When we look at this diagram, guys, we clearly see the oak forest being the taller plants, they being the more adapted to those conditions. So a characteristic of the climax species would be those group of organisms that are best suited to the environment at that given period of time. Here we see the oak forest, which is developed over a period of about 150 to 200 years. These plants, or these trees rather, are more adapted to those conditions, and it takes a lot of time for them to be able to adapt to those conditions, and that process of time we refer to as succession. So we got to describe the feature. So these are taller plants. They have deeper root systems. They also they grow taller, and hence they greater ability to absorb sunlight. Okay, and these would have a complex reproductive pattern. So they produce seeds that allows them to establish that level of succession in terms of being the climax species. Let's move on to the next question. The grid below shows the factors that influence population change. Here we see a table giving us factors such as competition, predation, rainfall, disease, temperature, and food supply. Use all the letters from the grid to complete the table below to show which factors are density dependent and density independent. Guys, before we attempt to answer this question, remember we spoke about that the examiner would tend to dovetail two sections together. In this case, we're looking at a question from population studies that is combined in community structure and change, and hence it's important to be able to understand that sometimes you may get a question that will mean that the examiner is testing you in two different areas collectively. Here we're looking at density dependent and density independent factors. Remember, the word density dependent refers to factors that are responsible based on the density of the population or the number of individuals in that population, and the density independent factors are factors that are independent or are not dependent on the number of individuals. So when we look at these factors, the first, competition, guys, and if you know competition well, competition would increase when the population is larger, so that would be a density dependent factor. Predation, guys, there's more competition, there's more predation when there are lots of individuals in a population, so predation as well would be a density dependent factor. Rainfall, guys, is a natural factor, and that would contribute to decreasing a population based on. So if we have a flood and that's because of rain, that is independent of the population. That could affect a dense population or a sparse population, and hence we refer to rainfall as a density independent factor. So rainfall would be a density independent factor. Disease, guys, disease would be density dependent, and we tend to find that diseases spread easily. They Other organisms are contaminated when there are many in a small area. When there is a pandemic, when there is a disease breakout, populations that are dense easily contaminate each other, or it's easily passed on to other members in that population. And hence, disease would be a density dependent factor. Temperature, guys, would be an independent factor, because that would be a natural factor. It's not dependent on the environment. It's not depending on the number of individuals in that environment. And then finally, food supply, guys, would be a density dependent factor, because the amount of resources available would depend on the number of individuals. In dense populations, in populations where there are many individuals in that small area, food supply becomes a problem, and that could influence the population size. So we refer to that food supply as a density dependent factor. Let's move on to the next question, guys. Here we see a graph. The diagram below shows a graph which explains some features of population dynamics. Study the graph and answer the questions that follow. When we look at this graph, guys, we see two graphs. I'm going to highlight that for you in different colors. Here we see carrying capacity, and that is represented with this graph here. And we see, I'm going to highlight that in a different color for you, population size, which is clearly shown with this curve here. And we see different stages, and we see lots of arrows here, and we see some labels. Let's look at the questions very quickly. Give a suitable title for the horizontal axis of the graph labeled A. Guys, in population studies, often you'll find that it's often data that is collected over a period of time. In this case, it shows you the population numbers over a period of time. So time would be the variable that goes on the x-axis. So we would label that as time, and that's a 1-mark question. Let's move on to the next question. What unit would normally be given on the x-axis? Guys, when we look at population studies and population graphs, often time is given to us. In this case, if it's larger organisms, it could be given to us in years. If we're looking at microorganisms, it would be given to us in minutes or hours or days. And I'm sure in this case, we're referring to bigger organisms, and we would assume that it's larger organisms that would be referred to over a period of time, because their reproductive rates takes years, and hence the time factor would be years. So the unit here would be years. You could also use minutes, but you would need to motivate to say that these could be an indication of the population of bacteria, and I would say I would use years if I was showing the population of larger animals. Okay, right. The next question. Which letters on the graph represents logistic growth of the population? Guys, if you remember, logistic growth refers to a phase in a growth curve where the growth doubles over a short period of time. And in this case, if we look at this graph, we can identify a few stages. I'm going to look at the first stage here, and stage B would be the initial lag phase, and you can see that the growth rate is very slow. But as we look at when we look at the next stage, which is this, we see that over a short period of time the population doubles. So this would be the logistic growth phase. So the answer for that, which letter on the graph represents the logistic growth of the population, and that would be the letter C. So it's stage C. Here we clearly see the population increasing over a short period of time. Let's move on to the next question, guys. Give a suitable label for the region of the graph labeled E. So we've got to label region E. Guys, here we see in E, we see that the population decreases. And we refer to that as the phase of the negative growth phase or the decelerated growth phase. Here we see the population decreasing. So we refer to that as the negative growth phase, as we see that there is a deceleration in the growth of the population. Okay. The next question, explain why the curve is dropping at G, and that is for 2 marks. Guys, if we look at this graph, we see that G points to this graph here, and we said that that refers to the carrying capacity of that environment. Why does it drop at G? The question is, what happens when the population exceeds the carrying capacity? The environment offers resistance, and that would mean that the carrying capacity would decrease. So to ensure that the environment sustains that, the environment offers resistance, and hence the carrying capacity would decrease. So because of environmental resistance, the carrying capacity decreases. Okay, so it's because of an increased environmental resistance. And the reason for that is the population exceeds the carrying capacity. Guys, we've done a graph, a data response question. Let's have a break, and when we get back, we look at some more questions. Welcome back, guys. During this session, guys, we're going to look at social hierarchy in meerkats, and we're going to look at an essay and how we respond to an essay based on this topic. Okay, so let's look at, you guys probably have this in front of you, so I'm not going to read through the entire context, but I'm going to explain to you very quickly in terms of how meerkats arrange themselves in social organization. So we often have a dominant male and a dominant female, called the alpha male, alpha female, and they reproduce, and they are the ones that will only allow the offspring to be nurtured. You find that if the other females tend to reproduce, that they are shunned away, or they're removed from that organization, or sometimes they're even killed. And this is to ensure that their genes are passed on, the stronger genes are passed on from between the alpha male and alpha female. We also see that they have a division of labor, where you find you have a sentry who looks out, and he ensures that the predators are away or at bay, and he will tend to chirp out or call when he senses danger, and then the others will obviously respond to that call, and then they will take cover and protect the young. So let's read through the questions and see how these show organization within their society. What bonds exist between members of meerkat colony, and how do they reinforce these bonds? So we need to answer in terms of what bonds exist. So we clearly see that these are social bonding, and because they are social bonding, guys, and they are related to each other. So we're seeing social bonding, and they're related to each other, and they do this by, they often tend to, if we go back to we see this, that these animals groom each other, and that grooming often strengthens the social bonds that exist between them. So you find this in many species of different animals. We see this in monkeys, we see this a lot in primates, where grooming is a sense of social bonding that exists between members in that community. So grooming is an important part in developing the bonding between members in a community. Let's look at the next question. Identify the types of social organizations displayed by meerkats. So from the context, guys, we can see that firstly they show a sentry who stands out and looks out, and you'll find that is division of labor. That's one type. We also see, because he will warn the others, and the other members will run, and they take cover. You also find that there is an alpha male and an alpha female, a dominant male and dominant female. So we see that there is breeding hierarchy. So the two types of social interactions that we see here, we see that there is division of labor, and that ensures that that pack, that community survives. And we also see that there is a dominant male and dominant female, who are the only ones in that organization that are allowed to produce offspring. Okay, so we go on to the next question. Do all meerkats have the same role in the colony? Explain your answer. And as we saw from this example, we saw that there are individuals that play an important part in looking out, the sentries. They look out for danger and possibly alert the rest of the pack. We also see that there is a definite alpha male and alpha female, or dominant male and female, who are responsible for reproduction. So we clearly see that there's division of labor, and that different organisms or different members in that society play an important role, and collectively this community is functioning efficiently so that they survive. So we would be able to respond by saying that they show definite roles, and we've explained that we have breeding pairs and we have organisms that look out and protect the others. The next question: how does the sentry meerkat benefit the colony? Now if we go back, guys, we find that because he's the one that looks out and warns the rest of approaching danger, we find that this is an important member in the community, in the colony, and it's because of him that he can warn the others of potential danger. And this ensures that the young, the vulnerable, the females are protected, and then they can take evasive action. They can get into their burrows and remain safe. So the sentry play a very important role in terms of warning the rest of the colony of potential danger. And this role is often on a rotational basis, where you find different members rotating and carrying out the function of sentry. This ensures that the single member over that 1 hour or so ensures that he's most effective, he is fed, he's stronger during that time, and he can warn the colony of potential danger. Let's look at the next question. Why does the alpha pair ensure that only one litter is born at a time? Guys, you often find that young pups need, or the young meerkats in this case, need nurturing, and they need lots of food. To ensure that the young that are nurtured well, we ensure the alpha male and female will ensure that at any given time there's only one set of litter that are born, to ensure that they receive the adequate amount of parental care, nourishment and nutrition, as well as protection from the rest of the colony, so that they survive and become contribute towards the colony. Another important observation that you can make about the alpha male and alpha female: these are the dominant individuals, and because they are dominant, they tend to possess the dominant characteristics. And in nature, the dominant characteristics would be passed on and ensure that the offspring would inherit some of those dominant characteristics. So I think it's important in terms of that community having better characteristics in the offspring when the alpha male and alpha female are allowed to reproduce. How do they do this? You find that when the other females tend to reproduce, these females are shunned away, they're chased away from that community, and sometimes even if the young meerkats that are born, these are killed by the dominant alpha male and female. Again, it's a survival strategy. The important thing that you take away from this is that in nature, individuals that are strongest are the ones that survive, and hence if the dominant alpha male and female are the stronger ones, they want to pass on their strong characteristics to the offspring. And I think in nature, survival of the fittest is a rule that applies, and hence stronger individuals are preferred to carry on the next generation. Name one other advantage of meerkats living in a social group. Okay, we spoke about division of labor, we spoke about them bonding with each other. So the importance of living together as a group is dividing of workload. The workload is divided. It ensures that all organisms have resources available to them, because that they allow to feed while one organism watches out for danger. Other benefits would be that they feed together as a group, and hence everybody gets food. So we can clearly see that the advantages will be division of labor, as well as ensuring that this species or that community survive. Guys, let's move on to the next question. We can look at an essay question that is adapted from the exemplar, a 2011 exemplar. Guys, the essay is normally at the end of the exam. It's a 17-mark question with 3 marks for synthesis. Often we get the learners writing through the exam, and then they get to the last 15 minutes and they still got this essay to go through. You got to make sure that you attempt the essay. It's very easy, especially towards the end of the exam. Often you've got to read through the essay topic very clearly and highlight the key points or the criteria that the examiner wants you to answer or respond to. So let's read through this. Using examples, we've got to use examples and describe predation, competition, symbiosis, explaining how each interaction influences the population size of the organisms involved. So simply we've got to use examples and describe the different relationships. We've got to describe predation, what predation is, providing an example, and explain how this influences the population size of the organisms involved. So we've got to explain those four relationships, giving examples, and how those examples influence the community, the size of that population. So let's look at a possible answer. So what I've done is I've pasted in a possible response to this. So the first thing you need to do is explain predation. Guys, predation, we've done examples already. In this case, a predator will capture and kill other animals or the prey for its food. The examples of this, you can give many examples, and often the easiest that comes to head would be a lion which would capture antelopes or even zebras, and they would feed off this. Here we see this, the prey population will decrease and the predator population would increase over a period of time, and for this you'd get about 3 marks. The next relationship that we need to explain would be competition, and in competition we've got to describe both interspecific competition, guys, as well as intraspecific competition. If you choose to describe interspecific competition, remember that you've got to give an example, and in this case interspecific competition is when organisms of different species compete for the same resources. Here we see an example of the flower beetles where they will decrease in population size while others would increase. So that would be interspecific competition. You could also cite an example of intraspecific competition, but you would need to explain intraspecific competition. And in this case, it is when organisms of the same species share the same available resource and compete against each other. An example would be owls, in this case, competing for the same resource. Here we find that the stronger owls will survive and the owl population would decrease over a period of time because of competition between the species. The next relationship that you need to describe is symbiosis, guys. And symbiosis is a close association between two organisms so that one or both benefit. So we refer to parasitism or mutualism as symbiotic relationships because these describe the interaction of organisms where either both benefit or one benefits and the host is harmed. So when we look at parasitism, guys, we clearly see here the benefit of one organism while the other is harmed, and the one that is harmed is referred to as the host. It's important that you use the correct terminology when writing and responding to an essay. You must give an example. In this case, here we look at tapeworms in humans. You can look at insects, you can look at parasites on humans, you can look at parasites on dogs, on cattle, and these would be where the host organism population gradually decreases as the parasite population increases. Okay, an example of mutualism, guys, would be the bacteria and the roots of leguminous plants, and here we see the plants benefiting as well as the bacteria benefiting. We refer to that as a symbiotic relationship where both the organisms benefit and hence both the populations increase. For that you would get 4 marks. And finally, we've got to explain the last relationship, which is commensalism, guys. And commensalism is also a symbiotic relationship in which one benefits without harming the other. An example of this would be sharks and the remora suckerfish, and here you find that the shark feeds and the remora suckerfish will cling onto the ventral side of the shark, and whatever bits of food that do not get into the shark's mouth, the suckerfish would live off that. The suckerfish does not affect the shark in any way. In this case, we refer to the suckerfish benefiting while the host, being the shark, not being affected in any way. In this example, we see that the population size of the organism that benefits will increase while the host is not affected in any way. Guys, we've come to the end of this session, and often you find that at this time of the year you've prepared for the exams. The key part in preparing now would be to go through the terminology, read through as many questions as possible. I think it's important to expose yourself, especially in this topic, to many data response questions, because often the examiner would put in different case studies and you need to respond to that. So for Life Sciences Paper 2 from my side, have a good day. Bye.